Here's what I love about memoirs from nonprofit and independent publishers. First of all, they're usually not from particularly famous people, and they might actually be from someone's perspective that would often be overlooked in the publishing industry. So you're getting the story of someone that you might not have heard of otherwise. They're usually quite often fairly literary, so the writing is often very beautiful, and sometimes it's even an experimental or really innovative form, or the writer is doing something new with the memoir genre that hasn't really been done before. So again, you're getting something that you might not see anywhere else. Related to that, a lot of memoirs from smaller presses are from writers, and so because their job is writing and they're writing a memoir, you often get little insights into the craft of writing and the creative life, which I particularly enjoy. Basically, what you often get from a memoir from a smaller press is what you get in general from a smaller press. Something fresh, something you're not going to find really anywhere else, something innovative, and usually something very beautifully written. So that's why I personally love memoirs from smaller publishers. And so I put together this list of 14 memoirs that are all from nonprofit and independent publishers. These are half books that I have read, and half of them are books I have not yet read. So I thought I'd share them with you today because I think they're really exciting. There's something about each of them that is fresh and exciting, maybe perfect possibly for your Nonfiction November reading. Before I get started on my list, I hope you'll tell me in the comments if you are a fan of memoirs at all, and if you are a fan of memoirs, give a recommendation of a memoir that you have loved, no matter the publisher. It doesn't matter what the size or type of publisher is, just recommend a memoir in the comments below. And then I hope you'll comment on each other's comments because I always think that's really fun. So first up, I want to share a book that I read, I think last year, and I have mentioned a bunch of times here on this channel because it's maybe one of my favorite memoirs I've ever read. This is Strip by Hannah Sword. It's published by Tortoise Books, and this is the story of, I feel like I'm about to say it's Hannah's story, but obviously it's a memoir, so that much is obvious. This starts in Hannah's young childhood. She was raised mostly by her father, who was a poet. They had a very bohemian lifestyle, but Hannah experienced some extreme and horrible trauma and abuse in her childhood. So the book starts there. So it's a pretty intense memoir. And from there it goes into her young adulthood. She, in order to make money, she worked as a stripper and as a prostitute. She eventually started abusing various substances, including meth, in order to lose weight. She encountered a lot of really interesting characters and in her life, and kind of has a lot of very interesting, a lot of it really difficult, dark, but also funny and ultimately hopeful stories to share in her memoir. And I thought it was beautifully, beautifully written, and I highly recommend it. So I don't have all of these books because some of them I got from the library. So an example of one that I don't have physically anymore is Sinkhole by Juliet Patterson, and it's published by Milkweed. And Sinkhole is a memoir exploring the author's family history with suicide. And in particular, her father had just taken his own life when she started the memoir, and she has several people in her family who had committed suicide. And she really dives into her family history to try and figure out why is there this pattern in her family. And along the way, she returns to her family's hometown, which was in Kansas, and explores the intense environmental trauma that exists in that part of Kansas due to extensive mining. And she really ties the devastation in her family to the devastation of the land, and it's done in a really beautiful way. And that's really indicative of a Milkweed book, is it's very tied to place and to the land and to the environment. And so if that kind of thing is up your alley, I highly recommend checking out any memoir really from Milkweed. They have a lot, but Sinkhole in particular was really wonderful. If you thought the last two were on particularly difficult subjects. This one is too. So another great memoir I read a couple years ago, or maybe a year ago, is called The Loneliness Files. It's by Athena Dixon and published by Tin House. And this is a memoir and also kind of a set of cultural essays and critiques looking into the subject of loneliness, and the author herself explores her own deep, deep loneliness and tries to tie it to, our interactions and social interactions in the digital age. But one of the defining features of this book is the exploration that the author goes into of cases of women, like relatively young women, who had some sort of medical emergency and died alone and had no connections in their life that would lead anyone to come looking for them. So they actually weren't found for years. And this becomes this deep fear in the author's mind and life that this is going to happen to her because she is experiencing loneliness so intensely. So the next one is a bit better known, I think, In the Dreamhouse by Carmen Maria Machado, and it's published by Grey Wolf. This is an example of a memoir that does something so fantastically innovative with the form of the memoir. And if you haven't encountered this book before, this is Carmen Maria Machado exploring. So she had been in a relationship with a woman that was very abusive, and for years she was trying to figure out how to process this relationship which had ended. But it's something that's not same-sex abuse in a relationship is not something that is publicly explored very often, especially in relationships between two women. And so she just really felt like she had no precedent, very few precedents for exploring this traumatic experience in writing. And so eventually she used narrative in a very Carmen Maria Machado style, very unique to her. She used narrative tropes, like for example, the haunted house, to really explore and dive into this abusive relationship. And it's just so innovative and very, very well done. Another one I read this past year is called Touching the Art by Matilda Bernstein Sycamore. This is published by Soft Skull. Is it Soft Skull? Technically it's Soft Skull, which is an imprint of Catapult. It used to be its own publisher, but then they combined. Anyway, moving on with Counterpoint 2, I think. So Touching the Art is brilliant. I heard an interview with the author and then ran out and bought the book immediately. So this is the story of Matilda's grandmother, paternal grandmother. Her name was Gladys, and she was a pretty well-known artist. Gladys really was one of the main drivers behind Matilda Bernstein Sycamore wanting to live a creative life. So everything she understood about creativity and art making, she learned from her grandmother Gladys. Obviously, this is an extremely, extremely important relationship to Matilda, and she adores her grandmother and looks up to her. But there's also an extremely complex nature to their relationship, and Gladys did a lot of really awful things to Matilda and really ultimately rejected her when Matilda came out as a trans woman in particular. And so this book is at its core exploring that relationship and how complex those kinds of relationships are when you adore someone and look up to them and you've gained so much from them, but also they have caused you so much trauma. But it's also a book of history and looking at class relations and race relations and the history of Baltimore and Jewish communities in Baltimore and white flight and art in general. And it's so wonderful. So I highly recommend Touching the Art by Matilda Bernstein Sycamore. This little book is gonna pop up maybe here and there in other of my videos because it is so many different things. So this is Self-Portrait in Green by Marie Ndiaye. Again, I have still yet to look up how to pronounce her last name, but it's translated by Jordan Stump, and it's published by Two Lines Press. And this is an impossible to describe book. It could be a novel. It was supposed to be a memoir. I think she was originally asked to write a memoir and came up with this. It is the story of a woman who lives in France, and there is a river, and the river is flooding, and there are these women that she encounters over the course of her life who are called the Green Women, because they usually are wearing green, but sometimes they're not wearing green, and some of them are ghosts who keep coming back. Some of them are not. One of them is her mother. They're all like kind of versions of herself, and it is not hard to read. It's the prose is easy to follow, but it's just impossible to describe. This is one of those books that's like all vibes. It's all eerie, strange, but beautiful vibes. And I loved it. Another book that's gonna come up a whole heck of a lot in the near future this is not the English version that I have grabbed here, but it's The Years, or Les Années by Annie Ernaux, and it's translated by Alison Strayer, if I'm remembering that right, and it's published by Seven Stories Press. And this is another one of those, like, is it a novel, is it a memoir kind of thing. It takes place over the course of the narrator's, Annie Ernaux's, the narrator's life, from I think like 1941 up until 2006 maybe. And it is a personal history, but it is also a sweeping history of France. And it is about politics and culture and society, French society. And ultimately, though, it all comes down to being about memory, both collective memory and individual memory, and how over time the way collective memory is formed has kind of changed, and how that impacts the way individual memory is formed. And she is a Nobel Prize winning author, so it is, of course, brilliant. So those are a few memoirs that I have read to share with you. I have a few here also that I own but have not yet read, and I am very excited to read. The first is The Magical Language of Others. It's by E.J. Koh, and this is published by Tin House. And this is another one that's really innovative in form. This is the story. So E.J. Koh, when she was a teenager, her parents moved to South Korea, where they were from, to work, but they left Koh and her brother, both teenagers, behind in California for like several years. And her mother would write her letters in Korean, but at the time, as a teenager, Koh couldn't read Korean very well. So she never really fully understood what her mother was saying in any of these letters. And so years later, she found all of these letters somewhere stored away and had become much better at Korean, and so decided to translate them. And this memoir is her translation of those letters, but it's also like the letters themselves. So like you have actual copies of the actual letters and then the translations from the author. Then interspersed through that are kind of stories of her family history and her personal life. I also heard a wonderful interview with the author about this book. This is several years old, but I've had it for a while, but I need to get to it. This one's a little bit more recent. This is Water on Fire, a memoir of war by Tarek El Aris. And so the author is a leading scholar on Middle East studies, and he also is originally from Lebanon. So this starts with his childhood in Lebanon and then follows him as his family is displaced from place to place to place. He has had a life that has been defined by displacement and war. I believe it alternates between his childhood perspective and an adult perspective. And then a lot of it is really about how storytelling becomes kind of a method of survival, like mental and emotional survival, when you live constantly in crisis mode. And it's just came out. This is published by Other Press. So this, I believe, was just published this year. And the last one I own but haven't read yet is The Story Game by Shu-Wei Chua, and this is published by Tin House. And this is yet another amazing example of a really innovative form of a memoir that is also, again, about the power of storytelling. And this is narrated, I think it's narrated by a woman who is laying on a mattress in a dark room and is telling stories from her life to a young girl who's also in the room. And the stories range from, identity to immigration to race to family to mental health. But lurking underneath these stories is a secret, like something that the narrator can't remember, and I think through the stories is able to kind of rebuild whatever this traumatic memory is. I can't believe I haven't read this one yet, actually, because this sounds absolutely brilliant. So a few other memoirs, actually there's a lot of memoirs that I wish I owned, but I have to end the video somewhere. So I picked 4 that are on my radar and I wish I owned. The first one I can't believe I haven't bought yet, actually, and that's The White Mosque by Sofia Samatar, that's published by Catapult. I am a huge Sofia Samatar fan. I believe she is a most brilliant writer, and she's almost like an auto-buy author for me. So the fact that I don't own this yet, and that's a rare thing for me. So the fact that I haven't bought this yet, maybe it's good. It's like I'm delaying the pleasure of buying and reading this book. But this is the story of Sofia Samatar's journey through Uzbekistan, where she followed and recreated the path of a late 19th century group of German-speaking Mennonites who traveled from Russia into Central Asia and then attempted to settle there. And along the way, she shares stories about her own upbringing as the daughter of a Swiss Mennonite and a Somali Muslim. And again, she is just flat out brilliant. Another one that caught my eye a little while back is W3 by Betty Howland, and this was republished by Public Space Books. It was originally published in the 1970s, but was reissued by a Public Space because they have republished, I believe, all of her books, I think. So this is the story of how Howland, at the age of 31, and as a single mother, was committed to the psychiatric wing of a hospital in Chicago after she swallowed a bottle of pills. And again, this has been on my list for a little while now to check out. I also have here a brand new memoir called Come By Here, a memoir and essays from Georgia's Geechee Coast by Nisha Powell Ingebeyer. And this is published by Hub City Press, which is a publisher that is dedicated to voices from the American South. And this is a brand new debut memoir. And in 2020, the author's hometown in Georgia became infamous for the viral video of white vigilantes murdering Ahmaud Arbery. And so the essays from the author, these memoiristic essays, trace the systemic racial violence of her hometown, but also honor the area's long history of Black culture and resistance. And it sounds amazing. And this, I think that just came out maybe like in September or October. And the last one I'll mention, although I feel like I could have mentioned a million other memoirs, especially from Milkweed, is another memoir from Milkweed, and that's Walking the Ojibway Path, a memoir in letters to Joshua. And it's by Richard Wagamese, and this is actually another republished book. It was originally published in 2002 and then reissued in 2023 as part of Milkweed's stunningly beautiful Seed Bank series. And these are letters from the author to his 6-year-old son, from whom he was estranged. And in the letters, he's telling his own life story and history with substance abuse, incarceration, and his life with books and writing. And then woven along with his own life story are the stories and teachings from the Ojibway community and tradition. And it just sounds beautiful. And the Seed Bank series itself is a stunningly beautiful series from the generally beautiful publisher Milkweed. So those are 14 memoirs from nonprofit and independent publishers. If you're new here, that's what I talk about, is nonprofit and independent publishers. That's what I love to read and share with you all. This is the place that people generally ask folks to subscribe, which I don't usually do, so I'm not going to do that. What I am going to ask you to do is subscribe to something, which is my newsletter. And in my newsletter, I send a monthly huge, ridiculously long list of books that have been recently published by nonprofit and independent publishers. And so, again, that's something I send out monthly. I'll leave a link to the newsletter below in the description so you can check it out if you like. And my name is Sarah. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.